It was a cold winter night, with the air biting and the alleys shrouded in shadows, when I decided that I could no longer bear sleeping on the streets. Each night felt longer than the one before, and the desperation for the promise of shelter made me recall the rumors about a place called the House of Hope on the gloomy street of Laments. Though I had heard whispers about it being a strange place, no one ever clearly explained what was so peculiar about it. But at that moment, my priority was simple. Find a warm place to spend the night, maybe even get a meal. With an empty stomach and fingers numb from the cold, I pushed my fear aside and walked toward the unknown. When I arrived, I found myself facing an old building, a structure of bricks darkened by time, with windows that seemed covered by an eternal fog. The door creaked open, revealing a tall, thin man whose pale skin highlighted his deep, empty eyes. He didn't say a word, only stared at me with unsettling coldness before stepping aside to let me enter. As soon as I crossed the threshold, a shiver ran through my body. It wasn't the street's cold that hit me, but something deeper, almost supernatural. The air inside seemed thick with oppressive silence, as if even time avoided advancing in that place. The main hall was spacious but poorly lit, revealing dozens of mattresses spread out on the floor. Many people were lying there, but what caught my attention was the absolute silence. No one exchanged words, not even glances. Only the faint sound of the wind, which seemed to slip through a crack in the wall, disturbed the eerie stillness of the place. There was something deeply unsettling about this place, but exhaustion and the cold kept me from thinking too much. Against the growing discomfort in my chest, I took a deep breath and walked to one of the mattresses, hoping that silence would be my only concern that night. That first night, sleep took a long time to arrive. The oppressive atmosphere and the almost absolute silence kept me uneasy. But fatigue, like an unbearable weight, eventually overcame my resistance, and I fell asleep. It was in the middle of the night when I woke to a strange sound, a faint noise that seemed like a whisper coming from some corner of the shelter. My instinct made me look around, and I realized something was wrong. The woman who had been sleeping on the mattress beside me was no longer there. For a moment, I thought she might have gone to the bathroom or stepped out to get something, but minutes passed, and her absence began to feel longer than usual. Driven by curiosity and an unsettling discomfort, I decided to get up to see what was happening. I walked down the narrow hallways, trying to make as little noise as possible. The dim light from the lamps cast eerie shadows on the walls, heightening my unease with every step. It was then that I saw her. At the end of the hallway, the woman was standing still, but something about her didn't seem right. As I approached, I noticed that her eyes were abnormal. They were completely black, with no trace of white. She was mumbling something, but the words were incomprehensible, as if they came from a forgotten language. My whole body froze. The sight was disturbing. I tried to back away, trying not to draw attention, but the wooden floor creaked under my foot. At that moment, the whispers stopped, and the silence returned to being absolute. But not for long. The woman slowly turned her head in my direction, in a way that defied any human logic, as though there were no bones in her neck. Her empty eyes were now fixed on me, and a chill ran down my spine. Without warning, she started walking toward me, but not in a normal way. Her movements were quick and awkward, as if each step was a mix of running and stumbling. The sound of her feet echoed down the hallway, and my heart raced. I froze for a moment, gripped by panic, before forcing myself to turn around and run as fast as I could, with the sense that something terrible was about to catch me. I raced back to the main hall, my heart pounding in my chest and sweat dripping down my forehead. But when I arrived, what I saw made my blood run cold. Everyone who had been lying down was now standing, motionless, facing me. Their eyes, just like the woman in the hallway, were completely black, empty, and unsettling, It was as if they were watching me, but not as individuals. They seemed connected, moving in a sinister, coordinated way, as if they were a single entity. The silence was deafening, and only the sound of my heavy breathing filled the air. They began walking toward me, slow but determined, like predators who knew the prey had nowhere to run. Terrified, I screamed and ran for the door, my only chance of escape. When I reached the entrance, the man who had greeted me earlier was still there. He didn't seem any different. Tall, thin, with the same empty expression and black eyes. But now his presence was even more threatening, completely blocking my exit. For a moment, I thought it was the end. My muscles locked up, and fear almost consumed me. But something inside me reacted instinctively. I don't know where the courage or strength came from, but before I knew it, I was running again. I passed him, feeling a biting cold as I crossed the door, as though I had broken through an invisible barrier. The sound of footsteps behind me echoed through the dark streets, but I didn't look back. My only goal was to get as far away from that place as possible. I ran until my legs couldn't carry me anymore, and when I finally stopped, I realized I was far away, in a different neighborhood. I looked around, trying to orient myself, but the empty streets only reinforced the feeling that something inexplicable had happened. The next day, still driven by curiosity and terror, I decided to return to the Street of Laments to check the House of Hope. However, when I arrived, I found only an empty lot, covered in weeds and rubble. The building had vanished, as if it had never existed. To this day, I don't know what that place was, or what happened to the people who were there. All I know is that something terrible was left behind, and I prefer to never find out what really happened that night. Working as a nurse has always been my passion, and a few years ago, I found a job at a small nursing home located in a quiet village in the countryside. The place was surrounded by tall, ancient trees that gently swayed in the wind, creating an atmosphere of peace and isolation. The residents spent their days playing cards, reminiscing about the past, and enjoying long moments of quiet contemplation. I felt fulfilled taking care of them, listening to their stories full of wisdom and bringing comfort to their days. However, from my first day at the nursing home, I noticed something peculiar. Some parts of the building seemed inexplicably colder, even on the hottest summer days, and the hallways became eerily silent as night fell. It was as if an invisible presence lingered there, but I tried to ignore these sensations and focus on my work. One day during my night shift, I heard a sound coming from room number 12. It was a soft cry, like an irregular lament that echoed faintly down the empty hallway. At first, I thought it was a resident needing help, but when I entered the room, I found it empty. The elderly person who used to stay there had passed away weeks before, and since then, the room had been vacant, with the bed neatly made and the windows shut. Still, the sound persisted, growing in intensity, while an inexplicable cold filled the room. I felt a chill run down my spine, but I stood still, trying to understand what was happening. It was as if the room carried a memory, a sadness that hadn't been erased. Unable to ignore what was happening, I called a colleague to accompany me and check the room again. He came, half asleep, with an ironic smile, already anticipating that nothing would be found. When we entered together, the sound had stopped, and the room seemed as peaceful as before. He shrugged, saying I was probably too tired, and the nighttime routine could play tricks on the mind. Despite his attempt to reassure me, I knew this wasn't just a simple hallucination. That cry still echoed in my mind, and the cold I felt that night stayed with me as a reminder that in the nursing home, some stories seemed to have no end. Things took a more unsettling turn when Dona Elsa, one of the oldest residents of the nursing home, began to frequently report her nightly visits. She said that the shadows would appear beside her bed, remaining motionless, simply staring at her in the dark. Although her words were frightening, I initially attributed her accounts to her advanced age and frail health. However, it didn't take long for other residents to begin sharing similar experiences. They spoke of figures silently crossing the hallways, whispers seemingly coming out of nowhere, and a constant feeling of being watched. The most disturbing part was that the complaints mostly came from those occupying the rooms near number 12, which only heightened the mystery surrounding that place. Intrigued and increasingly unsettled, I decided to investigate the building's history. During an afternoon off, I delved into the old records of the nursing home and discovered a disturbing truth. Before becoming a nursing home, the building had been an isolation hospital in the 1940s, used to treat patients with highly contagious diseases. Among the reports, one in particular caught my attention: the story of a patient kept in room 12. He was described as violent and unpredictable, having been confined in complete isolation for years until his death. It was said that his behavior drove the medical staff to the brink of despair, and his presence became a burden to everyone in the hospital. After his death, reports of strange events began to surface among the staff, involving inexplicable noises and an uncomfortable feeling that spread throughout the place. This eventually led to the temporary closure of the hospital before it was renovated and converted into the nursing home it is today. Connecting these reports to what was happening, everything began to make a strange kind of sense. The cold I felt in the hallways, the sounds that seemed to come from nowhere, and the residents' reports seemed to echo an old memory of the place. It was as if the walls carried the weight of past stories, and room 12 was the epicenter of it all. Despite all the rational explanations I tried to come up with, the feeling that something from the past remained alive there in some way was impossible to ignore. This discovery transformed my perception of the nursing home, and each night of work became a mix of fascination and fear, as if I were coexisting with fragments of a time that refused to leave. That night, filled with a mixture of fear and determination, I decided that I needed answers. I waited until the nursing home had fallen into the silence of the early morning, grabbed a flashlight, and slowly walked to room 12. The door was locked, but I still had the key in my pocket. As soon as I entered, I felt the air change. It was heavy, suffocating, as if the very environment was pushing me out. The flashlight illuminated every corner of the empty space, but it seemed incapable of banishing the darkness that lingered there. Suddenly, I heard a sound, a low, indecipherable whisper, but it seemed to come from all directions. My breath quickened, and I quickly turned around to try to find the source of the sound. It was then that my eyes caught something in the mirror of the wardrobe. A dark figure with undefined outlines was standing behind me. I spun around, but no one was there. However, when I looked back at the mirror, that presence remained still, watching me. With my heart racing and the sensation that the air around me was freezing, I rushed out of the room as quickly as I could. The pressure in my chest was almost unbearable, as if something invisible was trying to crush me. I couldn't sleep that night, and every shadow or noise seemed to amplify the terror I had felt. By morning, I made the decision that I would never step foot in that place again. I quit, explaining that I needed to take time off for personal reasons, but I never revealed to anyone what had really happened. Each day away from the nursing home brought a mix of relief and unease, as if something from there was still following me. I started avoiding any route that took me near the building, fearing that simply being close could reignite that terrible experience. Even after I left, the reports about the shadows and sounds continued. The residents still mentioned figures and whispers, and some new employees also began to comment on the strangeness of the place. Although many preferred to believe that it was all just a product of imagination, I knew the truth. What I saw in the mirror was not a hallucination, and the presence I felt that night was as real as the cold that still runs down my spine every time I remember. To this day, whenever I close my eyes, I can feel that energy around me. cold, heavy, and filled with a hatred that seemed to reach for something beyond the world we know.